Hey everybody, welcome back. Two takeaways for today's program. One, the purchase agreement for the initial tract of land that led to the formation of Liberia is located after being missing for about 200 years. And two, slavery was first abolished in Liberia. Welcome, I'm Octavius, and I must begin by thanking all of my subscribers. Thank you so much for making this possible. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Like the video, share the video, comment, and keep your notification bell on. Thanks again. In case you haven't heard, Liberia's purchase agreement has been located after being missing for nearly 200 years. Our guest today is Dr. Carl Patrick Boros. You've met him before. And I begin our conversation by asking him to place the significance of this historical find in the greater context of Pan-Africanism.
That's a very important question. And I think that is the most important outcome, of this finding this document. The document in and of itself, it doesn't speak to the issue. But when you look at the documents surrounding it, and other findings that are related to it. For example, there's a transcript of the negotiations that was kept by Eli Ayres, the ACS representative. He did it on a daily basis. Today, this happened. And the next day, this thing happened. And so when you look at that transcript, what you see is that the negotiations between the Americans and the local rulers was going. The rulers are asking very sophisticated, strategic questions. If you come, what does that mean? What will be the benefit to us? And so on. And in the midst of those negotiations, two people came from Freetown. One was a man who worked on a slave ship, and the other was a slave trader himself. So they came to tell the chiefs, you don't give these people their land, because if they come, they'll put a stop to the slave trade. Yes. So the man who worked on the slave ship, he said, this Captain Stockton, he seized a slave ship that I was working on for no reason, just that we were, involved in carrying captives. And what right does he have to come and do that? And so the local rulers listened to them, their arguments, and they made a judgment that they were going in an abolitionist direction. They were not going to maintain the slave trade in this area. I find it very disrespectful that a lot of our commentators, they want to assume that the local rulers were not thinking people and all of them were somehow protective of the slave trade inherently. But the slave trade had been going on, damaging communities. The consequences were devastating for Africa. And these men in the Cape Masrata area made a judgment. It was not like an impulsive decision. The negotiation went on for days. And you could say the lawyers for the prosecution, the people who were in favor of the maintaining the slave trade, they came and they argued their side. But at the end of the day, the local ruler said, no, we're going in this other direction here. And they didn't just sell this one piece of land. After the African-American repatriates landed from Sierra Leone, they built thatch houses, they started staying up on the hill. Taiwan Peter and the others turned around and sold other small tracts of land to them. Uncultivated land. They said, we want to build Caldwell. Okay. New Georgia. Okay. So you can see that the vision was continuing of collaboration. And the ultimate result of that, and this is the main point that Liberians fail to understand, the main outcome of that was Liberia ended the slave trade along our coast first, before anywhere else in West Africa. The British was the British government was committed to abolition. They had their squadron based in Freetown, but they didn't end the slave trade in Sierra Leone until after Liberia. And part of the reason is the British power was on the sea. They were intercepting ships, but they were not present on the ground, usually. Liberia, the militia was on the ground. Not an army or militia, regular citizens joining together to say, let's move and get these people, this traffic out of here. So Liberia, that accomplishment belongs to the people of Liberia, not something that was done by the repatriates or done by the indigenous rulers by themselves. It was a joint effort.
Dr. Burrows, how did you know that this document was missing in the first place?
As you probably know, I've spent a lifetime conducting research on Liberia, and a lot of that time was spent working with the files of the American Colonization Society, and their papers are housed at the Library of Congress. So as I was preparing for the bicentennial, I started a couple of years ago trying to prepare some research on the purchase of the land and other issues related to the founding of Liberia. I started looking for the original document. The text of the agreement was published in newspapers a few months after the agreement was signed. The ACS was so excited to announce this to the public that they printed the text in various American newspapers. But in the 1830s, the ACS tried to assemble all of the purchase agreements for different tracts of land that were bought in the area of Liberia. And they appointed a committee to do that. The committee came back and said, we've got all these tracts of land agreements here, except for the original. We can't find it. So since the 1830s, no historian has seen the original document. There's a book called the Political and Legislative History of Liberia by a legal historian named Charles Huberich. That book was published in 1947 to commemorate the centennial of the Republic of Liberia. And Huberich mentioned in the book that he looked for the document, he couldn't find it either. So that's what led me to realize that the document was missing.
And where did you find it?
Well, that was a journey. I decided I needed to go, of course, beyond the ACS papers. I went through the ACS papers. I didn't find it there, and I deduced that it would have been in the hands of one of three lawyers who, whenever the ACS had legal issues in the beginning, it would assign the issue to those three in combination as a committee, or give it to one of them to look into the issue. And there are three of them. Francis Scott Key, who wrote the American National Anthem, was one of those lawyers. So his papers are here in Maryland where I am. And it was more convenient for me to start with his papers. I went through them, the legal papers. I didn't see anything there. And the third lawyer didn't seem to have left his papers, or they were not available to the public. That left me with the third, and that is Elias Caldwell, who was the secretary of the ACS in the beginning. But you see, in the beginning, the ACS was a volunteer organization, and he was working part-time for the ACS, contributing his time. But his full-time job was clerk of the U.S. Supreme Court, working for Justice Short Washington, who was a leader of the ACS. And it happened that Caldwell died shortly after this purchase agreement was signed, and before the ACS appointed a committee to look for it. You see? So when he died, apparently, he had a bunch of the ACS papers in his Supreme Court office, and they remained there. Eventually, they were put together with papers of Justice Bushrod Washington, and somehow or the other, those papers ended up being donated by some collector or descendant of Bushrod Washington, and they were donated to a museum in Chicago. It's the Chicago History Museum. Now, most researchers, historians don't go looking in museums for papers. You go to libraries. So it was an unlikely place. And when I went looking for papers related to Caldwell, and I saw there were some papers housed there, and they were related, also connected to Washington, I thought, oh, there's a good chance that the document might be among those, because both of them were connected to the ACS. I couldn't go to Chicago. The collection was not open to the public because of the pandemic. So I requested that they photocopy copies of these documents and send them to me. So they would scan them, put them online. I download, I print, I go through the papers. It was like 100 at a time. I didn't see anything in the first 100. Second batch came, I went through them. I didn't see anything. The third batch, the document showed up there. So when they showed up, I was just stunned. And it was a combination of, could this be real? And finally, this thing actually exists. But there was some disbelief, actually. And the following day, I then requested that they take a photograph of the document, both sides, and forward that to me as well. So I went through and saw that the handwriting matched the handwriting of Dr. Eli Ayers, who was the ACS agent. He signed the agreement with Lieutenant Captain Stockton, Robert Stockton of the U.S. Navy. He was representing the U.S. government. So when I checked their signatures, I matched it against other documents. I matched the handwriting against Ayers' handwriting and matched. Then I thought, oh no, this is it.
The tract of land we're talking about is basically Cape Mesurado, right? And how much land are we talking about?
There have not been like the careful investigations that are required, and people have settled for, they say. So immediately after the agreement was signed, the accounts were put out that there were millions of acres, or there are thousands of acres, or so many square miles, but no one had surveyed the land that was being bought. And from then until now, no one had really stopped to examine the issue that carefully. But that's what historians are supposed to do. So I know from my research that territories now included in Monrovia, Greater Monrovia, were actually purchased later, right, after this agreement was signed. The area known as Caldwell was purchased separately later by the ACS. Bushrod Island was not bought as an entity at one time. A portion of Bushrod Island was bought a few years later after this original agreement, and it was bought from a woman who was the head of that part of Bushrod Island. So, what I then deduced was that given the fact that Bourgeois Island was added later, Caldwell added later, and so on, the land that was in question was actually what is now central Monrovia on the top of Cape Mesurado, that rocky area up there. And I'm saying I deduced that not just because these other tracts of land were bought later, but also because of the descriptions, written by the people who were involved, in those events. And they would talk about going up the hill from Providence Island to build shelters up there for the people who were coming from Freetown. Yeah. So it was a small territory of land. Yeah, it's about 140 acres today.
About 140 acres. And how much did they pay for that 140 acres that was the initial piece of land that later became what we now know as Liberia?
They paid with goods that were worth $300 US. Now, this causes, again, a lot of confusion among people who don't understand that during that period, in the early 1800s, cash was useless in West Africa, right? You didn't have banking institutions. What are you going to do with paper money or, any of those? So generally, trading was done on the basis of you give me so many goods in exchange for these items.
A barter system.
Yes, in effect, a barter system. And that was common, very commonplace. So this was not unusual for a transaction to be done on that basis. So in this case, it was land in exchange for $300 worth of goods. The goods included guns, ammunition, other things of substantial value. But you also find that there was tobacco and there was rum, included among those items. And rum and tobacco were common commodities that were valued along the West African coast because you couldn't grow tobacco in West Africa at the time, and rum was, a luxury item, so to speak. You see, the thing that amazes me is how condescending many of our contemporaries are in regards to our ancestors. So I often hear people laugh, talk about how they must have been naive or, how could these people have exchanged land for rum or tobacco? But you see, the reality is that those items, because they were luxury items, they were imported items, were valued quite highly. And the reason I say I just am amazed at the condescension of some of our peers is because you go to Liberia today and someone wants to show you that, they are successful and they are going to provide you with the best available. Oftentimes, they're going to bring imported liquor. You follow me? Today, it might not be rum, it might be champagne or something along those lines. But the same commodities from abroad is what people are using to show that, I'm a person of substance. And so, yeah, they were buying the land with items that were of value to the local rulers. The other misunderstanding is that money value does not stay still, it does not stay unchanged. So when you take a quote regarding the value of something in 1821, you need to then check against the table of how currency values have changed over time. And the tables show that $300 in 1831 will be worth $7,000 today. The other issue is when people hear this, they don't take that value and put it in context. We usually take it in isolation, and then we make our judgments about it, and we're quick to judge, say, look at what they did. Oh, how could they have done this? But the reality is, if you took a similar piece of land in the United States at that time, you would have paid about $1,000, maybe $2,000 max. And it shows you the comparative value, right, that the local rulers were able to get for that place.
So the other issue, the issue of concern, I should say, is that the local people did not understand English. Well, first of all, is that true? And how did that impact the negotiations for the purchase of land by the repatriates and our indigenous people who were already on the ground?
Yeah, and you're right to say that that is generally, assumed. The reality is that it is simply not true. Many American anthropologists who have written about Liberia, and they have argued or claimed that many of the groups in Liberia today, ethnic groups, were hunters and gatherers. The Kru, the Gola, so many others. You go and read their writings. This is what they have claimed. And then Liberian scholars have imbibed this uncritically. They swallow it. Then they project that backwards onto the people. The one exception that many of these anthropologists make is to say, oh, but the Mandingos, they were civilized. The other groups, they were hunters and gatherers. That's what has affected our judgment of them, our mentality towards history. So here's the reality. Pedro de Centra, the first European to come to this region of Liberia, arrived in the mid-1400s. So from 1400 until 1800, the area called Cape Mesurado had been in constant contact, right, with the West. First with Europeans, and then with Americans who joined them. So in the course of those interactions, people on the ground began learning Portuguese. The remnants of Portuguese from the 1400s remains embedded in colloquia in Liberia. When we say dash for a gift or a bribe, is from Portuguese. When we say palavra hut, palavra sauce, it's a Portuguese word that came from discussion or conference. So it's not only in our language, but it's also in West African, pidgins or creoles, Sierra Leone Creole. They say sabi, to know something. That's Portuguese. So people were learning, local people would learn Portuguese, learn other European languages to communicate with their business partners. And they were learning English. Now, the British decided first to act against the slave trade from West Africa going across, carrying slaves across to the Americas. They began to do this in the early 1800s first. They sent a naval squadron to Freetown. They were based in Freetown. And they used to patrol the coast to intercept slave ships. Okay. When the slave trade began, there were local people who were working on those slave ships. You follow me? People who knew about the sea, and they were maritime, oriented people. And then when the British anti-slavery vessels came, every one of their vessels had crew people working on them. Everyone. I'm not saying this on my own. I'm telling you that the commander of the squadron, that's what he said. And to communicate with the commanders of the ships and to communicate with the other crew members, they needed to learn English. So we had a lot of crew people, crew men who were working on these ships who spoke English. Secondly, Sao Boso, the renowned leader of the Kondo Confederation based around Bopulu. People used to call him, his nickname was Boatswain, because he had worked aboard one of those ships. A boatswain is a position on the ship. And he worked there for years. And so Salboso spoke English. But here's the clincher. You see, there was a man living on Providence Island named John Mill, mother African, father English. The father took him to Liverpool, and he was educated there for 12 years in British schools. And then he came to Providence Island to take over the father's business. And that business, which had made the father very rich, and made the person who his father had assigned to operate on that island, another British man, very rich. So the business that was at the core of what they were doing was the sale of African captives. John was involved in that initially, but around 1820, he said this involvement had been bothering him and causing him a lot of disturbance and anxiety psychologically, that he decided around 1820 he would get out of the slave trade and he would sell other things. So that Providence Island used to be a slave prison area. John Mill, who spoke English, who went to school in England, became the scribe, meaning secretary, and interpreter for the local rulers when they were negotiating with the Americans. The Americans were there for several days, back and forth negotiating. You know how in Liberia negotiation usually takes a little longer than elsewhere, right? Yeah. So the negotiation will go on for a while, and the local rulers would not begin anything on a day if John Mill was not there. And then when they would send message for him when he comes, the negotiations will begin.
The whole concept of private property versus communal land was absent at the time. Is it true that our people had no concept of private property, and so therefore this causing to question this whole transaction of people coming from America to buy land on the continent?
The reality is there were several different forms of land ownership patterns that coexisted in the area of Cape Mesurado. I'm not saying in Lofa, I'm not saying in Nima, because what was going on in those regions was different from what was going on the coast. You follow me? Okay, so the coast had been in contact with the West, with Europe, for centuries. And as I indicated, Providence Island had been held not just by John Mill, a slave trader, but by his father's representative before John came from school, who was a British slave trader. Before that, by his father, who appointed that man as a guardian of his business. And we can go back 4 or 5 other British traders that we know who controlled that land based on agreements that he had with the chiefs. So for decades, that land had been occupied by Europeans. You follow? With the acquiescence of the chiefs. And Providence Island was not the only one. Edina was another. They preferred to operate off of islands, but there were other parts of Liberia, what we now call Liberia, that were occupied by Europeans, and the chiefs agreed for them to hold those lands. So when I said that, land ownership was not either or. The traditional system was that if an individual came to a community that was settled and wanted to sit with them and to have access to land to farm, the land owner, who would be a member of generally the oldest member of the family that first cultivated land in that region, that landowner, representative of the family, would be the one who would give you access to the land. And to get that access, you have to give a gift. So that just shows respect. It just shows, that I recognize your claim to this place. And it might be a one-time gift. It could be over a couple of years. Then you become a member of the community, and you are there. You are integrated into the community. So the principle existed going back in time as a tradition that individuals could come and be assimilated into a community. The same principle applied to groups of people who would come, but they wouldn't come and join the community per se. They wouldn't come and occupy the land that people were already cultivating. So in that case, when a group came, what you do is you give a gift to the landholders in the area, but they will give you access to uncultivated land nearby. You follow? That's not land that they invested that labor in. It's land that's sitting near. But for you to come sit near us, you come and you honor the land holding family and say, we show you respect and everything, but we want to sit over there. So, okay, y'all go sit. That principle had been in place for centuries. The Day ethnic group was the first documented group to settle between the St. Paul River, Cape Mesurado area, going to Cape Mount. And the Vai came from Mali, their ancestors came and settled among the Day. Later on, the Gola were pushed from the north into the area of Bomi County and some all the way down to Cape Mesurado. To Cape Mount. And when they entered Cape Mount, the same thing, they settled among the Day and the Vai. So today we got people who are identified as Day Gola. We got people who identify, as Day Vai, and so forth, in different combinations. You have Vai people who are called Golokai, Gola men, but they are culturally Vai. So that's how over the years things have been operating. So when the repatriates came, the African Americans came, is another group that's coming to settle among the Day, and the ruler said, okay, give us something, honor us, and you can go sit on our side.
We've gotten a lot of publicity about this find. You were covered by the New York Times, Washington Post, Liberian Observer, Front Page Africa. Have you gotten any pushback from anywhere? Because this is paradigm shifting information. Have you gotten any pushback from anywhere, any sector of Liberian society?
One correction: the New York Times, hasn't covered it. It was the Post that did the first, and like you said, the Observer and others came on. But there are a lot of people who have texted me to say how surprised they are with the kind of reaction that this has engendered. They expected there to be some kind of outcry and pushback, but I haven't experienced that. And I would say it hasn't surprised me in this regard because during the time I was last in Liberia promoting a book, staging a play on Hillary Teague, I came to understand that there's a real hunger among Liberians, especially younger Liberians, to understand our history. The myths that have been passed on by some of our uncles are not satisfying. They're not explaining us to us. So people are trying to figure out how come, what's the real story? And I think that's partly why there hasn't been that significant pushback. But the second thing I would say to you is you're familiar with the Kola Forest book that I did, Between the Kola Forests and the Salted Sea. And I spent 35 years researching before I got down to the writing and all of it of the book. And it meant that I was collecting documents, I was collecting oral histories, I was looking at archaeological findings, right? I was looking at historical linguistics, how languages change and how they are related, to put all of that together. Because since our people were not leaving behind written documents themselves, then I consult the oral history and then look at what other people were writing about them. Some of those documents were in Arabic, translated into English for me to use. So when you have that diversity of sources that you're working with, I think people are more, engaged in a querying conversation.
There is an Israeli historian, Harari, Yuval Noah Harari, whose view of history is that we shouldn't just consider the past. We should consider the past, the present, and then make possible projections about the future. What lessons should Liberians take away from this find, and how can we calibrate that into our future?
Wow, that's a tough one. Basically, my comment would be this: wars have a predictable impact on societies everywhere. Everywhere. The Americans went through a civil war. The French had their upheaval at the time of the Revolution. And one predictable outcome is that it fosters deep divisions. All right. So once those divisions get in play, then you find people with a mindset that emphasizes difference, and they begin to bury commonalities. And we have taken our war experience and we projected it back onto the past. So we say, just how we divided today, the people in the past were always divided like that. And that's not true. And I'm hoping that out of this experience, people will take that with them. If you look at the Cape Mesurado area, what you find is a kind of cosmopolitan community, an entreport, right? Where people have contact with the global community. So the Dey settled there first, but the crew had a settlement around where the Freeport is now. And many of the men from that settlement would be the one to offload ships and so forth, right? And load ships that came. So they had a community right in that area. Then at the foot of Mamba Point was a Mamba Bassa community. Now, the Mamba homeland and the Du or Dukuya subgroup of the Bassa, their homeland, are both in Magibi area. There's a place there, a water tributary that runs. Initially, it's a creek, and it runs down and empties into the Mesurado, right between the University of Liberia old campus and that island on the other side. The water runs down and then hits the Mesurado, and then Mesurado goes to the Atlantic. So that water was called the Du, because coming from the homeland of the Du. So the Du had a community down there, a subgroup of the Bassa, the Mamba, another subgroup of the Bassa, had a town. So that each of these ethnic groups had a community where they could buy things that were coming from overseas and then ship it up to their homeland. You follow? And Town on Bourgeois Island, right across from central Monrovia, that Town was there from the time the Americans came. But we know that the homeland is in Cape Mount. So it was strategically there as a conduit for exporting and importing goods through that Cape Mesurado area. So it was a diverse ethnic community. And that's why if you look at the contract that was signed, you find Peter Tawe was his title, as a principal person who signed it. He was from the land owning family among the Day. But then there were other rulers who signed because they were connected to different communities, in that area.
Well, I want to thank you so much, and I hope we can do this a little bit more often. Dr. Carl Patrick Boris, thank you so much today, sir.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Always honored.